Now I've come to the introduction of Rosemary Ommer. You can see me smiling, and Rosemary has been a wonderful colleague. I remember coming to UBC, that was in 1995. Don't remember the date because it makes me really discover that time is going, huh? 1995. I was then finishing my PhD, and I think a year or so after that, I met Rosemary. She had a huge project then called Coast Under Stress, and actually led scholars from across Canada. One of the really cross-disciplinary, life scale. It's amazing to see Rosemary in the room with about how many 200 scientists, and she's just getting us to work together. So I'm really happy. You should read her bio, and not only hers. I actually take time to read people's bios, and now I'm talking to our students, right? Take your time and read. There's a lot in that one paragraph that can help you really shape your path into the future. There's so much there I wouldn't be able to tell you, but Rosemary is going to talk about something which is really cool to all of us: interdisciplinarity at different scales. You know, we want to work with small communities, we want to work regionally, nationally, and also globally. How do you do that in an interdisciplinary setting? We have 40 years of experience in Rosemary, and now I get off and let you talk, and we'll come to the end of the seminar later. I don't want to talk too much. So over to you. Thank you for doing this and for starting us off. I believe it's going to be wonderful.
Thank you, Rashid, very much indeed. It's very kind of you. And I am honored to open the seminar series this year. It's delightful. I first came here when it was the Fisheries Center a very long time ago. And now it's the Institute of Fisheries, and I get the names mixed up all the time, but don't worry about it. In over 30, near 40 years of working in fisheries, including the problems faced by small-scale fishing communities, I have come to understand that complex issues of scale are fundamental to all our understanding. They so much underpin our thinking that they often pass unnoticed, and we fail to realize that the situations we're examining may be operating at conflicting or mismatching geographical, temporal, technological, and/or intellectual scales. There are others as well, but these are the most common. It is only by being aware of these different scales that we will be able to recognize when one or more of them are in play and may possibly be in conflict. Only then can we interrogate fisheries and their management adequately, recognizing at which scales we should be examining our topic. Scale in this sense is a graduated range of units of value forming a standard system for measuring or grading something. The ranges involved can be considerable. Geographically, the lens can vary from the atmospheric and global all the way to the local. Temporally, scales can vary from millennia or centuries or decades to time spans of a day or less. Technology is also scalar in the sense that we deal with large range of vessel and gear sizes, for example, and they have different implications for management. Even academic disciplines are scalar, in that the intellectual range at which scholars work may range from the disciplinary or even the subdisciplinary through multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary to transdisciplinary. And scales, as if that wasn't enough, can also intersect. Business, for example, operates in long and short-term cycles, as Kondraty told us in 1935, while functioning at various geographical scales at the same time. The point is that it's important to recognize whatever potentially important scale factors are involved in the issues we are studying and pay attention to how they interact. Clarifying this will then let us know how widely our work covers the matter at hand, and hence what we may have not included or not thought about that may also need to be considered by us or pointed to for consideration by other scholars. Small-scale, social ecological, community-based fisheries research comprises studies of communities of fish and their interdependent communities of fish, an important concept that's still inadequately recognized. In more recent years, such studies have been addressing issues of scale, And this has brought to light the narrow basis of current fisheries policy and its application in fisheries management globally, nationally, and locally. It has illustrated the kind of gaps or mismatches in the scholarship that lie behind policy and management matters. All too often, these arise from inadequate consideration of scale. It's a pity, because the problem of mismatches of scale has hindered the fruitful pursuit of ways forward that could result in more appropriate prosecution of fisheries at all levels in a changing and uncertain world. Let us examine the ones I have selected in turn. I'll start with the scholarly approaches, the intellectual scale of what we do. Fisheries scholarship in the past has suffered from too little interdisciplinary work, despite the complexities involved in fisheries. And that's a problem that has still not been widely understood and applied. It's hard to teach student scientists, given the way most academic institutions are currently organized, and also the organization of the funding sources available to them and their professors. This is deeply unfortunate, since discipline-based studies provide a necessary, but not sufficient, foundation for understanding all fisheries, not just small-scale fisheries and their interdependent small coastal communities. Initial disciplinary bridges in and between government and the universities have, of course, always been there, since most government scientists were university trained. But for most of the problems in fisheries, this is not adequate. There is a significant need for understanding of society, and hence the social sciences and humanities, if marine governance is to be responsive to the dilemmas it faces in fisheries management. This is increasingly being recognized, as in ICES or PICES of the United States Integrated Ecosystem Assessment, but more integration is needed even here. Some interdisciplinary bridges have been built, but these have mostly been between economists and marine biologists, probably because quantitative economic models and methodology are compatible with those of the biologists. However, as good as they were and are, such models do not and cannot take into account the complexities of human behavior, nor do they demonstrate adequate awareness of the marine environment. The thinking behind such Beverton and Holt modeling is, at its simplest, that the number of fish next year can be calculated from the number of fish that occurred this current year, the assumption being that the natural environment varies randomly and thus can be ignored over longer timescales. This has compelled scientists to apply their findings to larger than local spatial and temporal scales. One major problem here is a lack of awareness of local environments, and that renders such models seriously deficient, given the importance of small local scales where, for example, so many nurseries for fish occur. That can be remedied by the kind of interdisciplinary small-scale analysis that uncovers local human knowledge of marine environment, as well as the motivations of inshore fishing families, not all of whom, by the way, will necessarily always see things the same way. Within the university research community, interdisciplinary research partnerships between social and natural scientists began to develop and be fostered in the 1990s, although the same, sadly, cannot yet be said for many government science research programs. The first one in which I was involved came about after the collapse of northern cod, a social ecological disaster that rendered the cod stocks of the Northwest Atlantic commercially extinct and threw over 30,000 people out of work overnight. The resultant crisis created a funding opportunity to work across the great divides between health, natural science, and social science humanities in a Canadian government program called the Green Plan. In 1993, a team of 30 researchers from these three rubrics came together to carry out a program of eco-research, a name we adopted, to explore the social ecological ramifications of the collapse. We worked at various scales, including community level analysis, with marine scientists, sociologists, and ecologists, all involved in field research, including fisheries knowledge. That was something that was not generally accepted at that time. But we understood that working with fishers tells us about the complex dynamics that exist between communities of fish and communities of fishers, tells us about the relationship between these, and it makes us aware of how artificial is the divide between people and nature. I am aware that to say that humans are part of nature is to challenge received wisdom, and it's precisely that kind of thinking that has kept the social and natural sciences apart for a long time. Humans depend in an absolute sense on the environment in which we are embedded, although urban society in particular forgets that, protected as it is by the web of trade and technology that surrounds urban life. Let's move to geographical scale. As world fisheries have fallen more and more into disarray, it has become increasingly clear that working with human problems in the social sciences and humanities, and with the fish population programs in the marine sciences in separate solitudes, is proving increasingly dysfunctional. Newer work is involving social scientists, humanists, and natural scientists coming together in teams with communities and industry leaders. However, this remains highly unusual, but think of Ocean Canada, or think of US Integrated Ecosystems Assessments, think of the US Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management, Barbara Neese's CURA, not only Rashid's team, but also Rob Stevenson's team, not least because of the institutional impediments involved. It's keeping it highly unusual. And that's pity, because this is inhibiting this kind of good research. Such work is often detailed and painstaking, but it's essential and rewarding. The figure that's up on your screen now shows 4 different motivations involved in understanding fish and fisheries. Obviously, the data in which the fishing business community was interested would have been those data and analysis that would be a financial benefit to them, since businesses are mostly concentrated in the deep sea fisheries that are important for employment. These operate at very different geographical, technological, and political scales, and are carried out for very different purposes. Note that some of the human activities in Figure 1 may conflict, and they certainly require different levels of environmental detail. The local information that small-scale independent fish harvesters possess is probably the most finely grained and may go back a long way in time. This figure then is an overview of the scales at which the physical, biological, fishing and fishing communities operate, and how these can and often do intersect. Scale complexities are endemic in the fisheries. The beginning of getting at such environmental and human complexities in the context of fisheries began with the work of Verkes and others, who created the concept of social ecological analysis that set us on the path to researching and understanding human marine ecosystem reciprocal interactions. In an important 2011 paper for a global audience on the concept, Verkes noted, and I quote, that the delineation between social and ecological systems is arbitrary and artificial, and restoring unity in managing marine fisheries is necessary and is achieved through reconnecting social science, natural science, and humanities perspectives, reconciling the various disciplines as part of the process, unquote. Vikrit then discussed the implications of that and appropriate methodology. Now, as an approach, social ecological analysis is now being used more, but it has not yet met with wholesale adoption. It is a good way of understanding the interdependency of people and the marine ecosystem at a variety of geographical and temporal scales. Social ecological systems are, of course, complex, central to the evolving state of global fisheries, and by definition, they require interdisciplinary approaches and environmental awareness. When dealing with scale issues in social ecological systems, it's important to consider lay and expert knowledge, because it's important to think about the purpose for which such knowledge has been created. The matter is one of motivation or goal, and involves both geographical and intellectual scale. Fishers are harvesters. Their knowledge obviously is going to be about where, when, and how to catch fish. That means knowing a great deal about the fish themselves and their behavior within a local and thoroughly understood system. There are three groups to be thought about here: those small scale fishers, then academic scientists, and then government scientists. Let's start with the small scale fishers who know about fish and fishing assemblages, but only about the ones in which they have been engaged. In Trinity Bay, Newfoundland and Labrador, for example, their taxonomy for codfish, gathered from over to you and me in the 1990s, distinguished between what they called herring fish. They weren't herring, but they were codfish that came in the spring following the herring. And that was distinguished from the cod that came later. They talked about mother fish, larger, older, and more fecund female cod that they thought settled out in deeper water. And some thought they should be protected because of their importance to stock. Local taxonomies speak to local ecosystem dynamics. They also speak to behavioral and other complexities, and they do so in a way that standard stock assessment concepts like biomass cannot and do not. Because fishers classify fish according to local harvesting information built up often over generations, they are aware of micro-level variability and trends that are often invisible in stock assessment data. These kinds of knowledge can be aggregated by researchers across spatial and temporal scales, taking the data from interviews with fisher from different bays, through headlands to offshore, and from several generations as well. It is possible to assemble that information that's otherwise just about unavailable or only partly available in stock assessment data. Local fishers' knowledge encompasses effort as well as catch information, including changes in efficiency, along with spatial and temporal distribution of effort and information on fish migrations. That means it can be used to track trends in efficiency, which is crucial for the interpretation of catch per unit of effort data and relevant to understanding trends in abundance. Harvesters, as well as others in the industry, also know, of course, a great deal about markets and value chains, including past data. And this actually can provide insights on discarding practices, that is, fishing mortality that often doesn't make it into the landing statistics. Local fishers' collective insights may be similar to those from stock assessment science, in which case they provide independent verification, or where they differ, they provide the basis for careful analysis of both sets of information in order to move understanding forward. This is perhaps particularly important these days for understudied and relatively low abundance species that can be depleted through bycatch fisheries and targeted fisheries alike. As shown in research in the northern cod collapse, effort after that tended to shift to these other species in the context of resource decline. The wisdom of local fishers can point to information that government scientists using trawling samples cannot get far enough inshore to observe and monitor, as in distribution trends in eelgrass bed abundance, for example, where local knowledge has led to an appreciation of its value as critical nursery areas for fish and shellfish. In like manner, the traditional knowledge of First Nations on this coast has given us information on, for example, seamounts and cold water sponges, about which Indigenous fishermen and even some non-Indigenous commercial fishermen have long been aware. Our second group under consideration is marine scientists. They are classifiers of a different kind. Their task is to understand the species as a whole and in all its physical and related behavioral complexity, and then to describe that to science. Although that's changing a little now as scientists become more acquainted with the importance of writing more broadly, as the recent IPCC report, for example, shows. Marine scientists then deal with the species writ large. They are generalists, where fishers are particulars. The third group, government scientists, are kind of halfway house between the other two. because they work with the specialist scientific language of classification, but then apply that descriptive and classificatory knowledge to issues of harvest management in order to make recommendations to policymakers about management regulations. Strictly speaking, they should actually be a bridge between the other two groups. But sadly, the local one has been ignored by them, although they could be working on generating inshore management regulations, the lack of which is an ongoing problem. But the frame of their work is always actually much wider than that, perhaps covering several ecosystems or a whole coastline and pertaining to more than deep sea fisheries. Beyond that, they may work with other nations in order to deal with blue water ocean roaming fisheries. And I'm not going to get into the additional complexities of that, except to note that the larger NAFO zones, for example, are a problem, not least because they influence the scale at which data are aggregated and quotas set. Here we are dealing with what is essentially a technological scale difference, and that's a category I'll consider later. It makes sense for all scientists involved in fisheries research, management, and policy to listen to the language of harvesters at all scales, because it will contain information of use to harvesters and hence also to harvest managers, as well as to academic scientists interested in species behavior and evolutionary distinctions between subspecies. When, as is all too often the case, government science works with only economists, they are not only missing out the local picture, but they create policy scale mismatches because they miss completely out on the first local part of their mandate. It's a pity, partly because at the local scale, problems are obvious to those living with them. But at larger scales, such problems become less obvious, so policymakers often ignore them. Hence, misunderstandings arise actually in both directions. Government science assigns incorrect motivations to communities, which intensifies an existing lack of trust and respect for small-scale communities, since these scientists have not acknowledged and dealt with the various scales involved, particularly that at which local fishers operate. The obverse of that coin is the distrust that fishers have for government scientists and policymakers. I will come back to that again later when I consider technological scale. Figure 2, which is up there now, shows the oversimplicity of the current management model on the left when compared to the kind of complexity that we have been discussing. The figure offers some explanation for how complex the web of interest in fish and fisheries actually is. And to be honest, the right side of the figure is to me an explanation of why fishery managers try to keep it simple. It is simply too complicated. Figure 2, of course, shows an ideal type on the right, and it's probably unachievable, at least in the foreseeable future, but there is no good reason why thinking that something somewhat more complex than the left-hand side of the figure could not be taking place among fisheries managers, because it could. If such complexities were treated seriously, it would let us deal openly with the different scales that are involved in both the human and the interdependent natural world subsystems, and do so without involving the artificial divide between humans and nature. The challenge, of course, will be significant, but it urgently needs to be tackled if we are to bring small-scale fisheries and their interdependent fishing communities to the attention of managers and policymakers, both national and international, and convince them that the local and the global are distinct, but they are deeply connected. Let me turn now to temporal scale. A third scale problem is that of temporal scale mismatches, such as that manifested by the shifting baseline syndrome that Daniel Pauly has pointed to and that we showed in Coast Under Stress, and that is figuring in papers from Jeff Hutchings to Shins et al. And in fact, it's their figure 1 figure, which is in an article currently in press, that I'm going to be using now. It's one that you'll be familiar with. Figure 3 and here it comes, is well known. It shows what happens when starting analysis of trends at an artificially selected time, perhaps based on convenience, perhaps on ease of attaining records, happens. The end result is a timeline which purports to show a trend that may be misleading and not consistent over a longer time span. Work that we did in partnership with Tony Fitcher and the Sea Around Us project in what was then the Fisheries Centre showed the problem on the scale of the whole West Coast fishery over time, going back to archaeological time. So the next two figures, figure 4A and 4B, there's 4A and that's Newfoundland, and 4B is the Hecate Strait. These two together show the problem and its attendant ills, which you will all know and be familiar with as fishing down the food web. I apologize, by the way, for the quality of these two slides, but in a condominium in Salt Spring, it's very hard to get the kind of technology that's needed to do any better than this. This is just my inadequate attempt. I don't intend to belabor the point of fishing down the website here at the Fisheries Institute because so much of that thinking was developed there. However, as well as showing the problem of shifting baselines and fishing down the food web over time, our work in Coast Under Stress also showed that it's important to recognize not just present, but also past motivations and goals and states of knowledge way back when, including that of what data existed and how well they fitted the analysis for which they were being employed. In this respect, by the way, the work done by Nancy Turner and her First Nations colleagues has underlined the temporal dimension in their thinking. And it's worth pointing out at this point that Indigenous thinking about fisheries, as about everything else, is rooted in the concept of stewardship, an essential multi-generational temporal scale of thinking about the environment, including the oceans, that is historically and culturally informed. Now I get to technological scale. Interaction between the local and the large happens in small-scale fisheries management as well, but the interactions are complex and they're not always obvious. A serious problem in terms of technological scale, and one that still makes me angry actually, was evidenced by the 1995 Kirby report on the Atlantic groundfish fishery. That report thought the inshore fishery was over-subsidized since it was not taking all its quotas. The inshore fishers that I was working with at the time complained bitterly that they couldn't catch their quotas because deep sea trawlers had already left insufficient fish for inshore fishers to catch. Remember, that's the mid-1990s. Deep sea fishery vessels individually generate significant fishing effort when compared to smaller midshore vessels or small inshore vessels, where the effort is by extension significantly less. The implications for management of these different amounts of effort are that technological scale must be mirrored in marine fisheries management. Said otherwise, fisheries managers should not be thinking in terms of too many fishers chasing too few fish, but in terms of too much effort, too many large-scale trawlers chasing too few fish. The collapse of the groundfish fishery in the Northwest Atlantic and the shift to and subsequent decline of shrimp, lobster, and crab in that area show how these interactions work together. The shift to new fisheries in new places has led to increased production costs and new occupational health risks for humans. This is coupled to stock recovery failures, and they in turn have led to fishing down the trophic levels. That then creates new fisheries in still poorly understood, underutilized species, which then creates greater scientific uncertainty. It produces fewer fishers using the same or greater fishing effort because the managers need to remember that technology is the key variable here, not employment, not the numbers of workers. It is that confusion in thinking that leads to communities declining and fishers being driven to outmigrate. The end result is residual communities facing continued human and biological risks and becoming increasingly mired in social inequality and poverty. It's not a pretty picture, but it is an accurate portrayal of what happens when scientific analysis starts at the large scale and works down from there, blurring the details of lived reality, which can only be found from bottom-up analysis. One also needs to remember that human experience impacts the natural world. That is, what people can end up doing to the marine ecosystems upon which they depend is a responsibility for all of us. Let me begin to wrap up. Unless we understand not only what we do and how we do it, but also why we do it, there is little hope that things will change. It's only when one understands the root motivations for human actions that one uncovers the place from where to start instituting change. But otherwise, when a policymaker understands that by imposing this regulation on these communities, the communities will be forced to respond in this way, which will in turn have this impact on the ecosystem, then policymaking and policy thinking will finally have the data from which to make wiser decisions, regulations that will work with people to bring about healthy communities of both fish and fishers. In future research, as figure 2 showed, that's the one with the simple DFO and the overly impossibly complicated ideal type. In future research, as that figure showed, we are increasingly going to need to think of those complicated nested social ecological webs composed of human institutions and natural environments that cross scales. This is going to be hugely complicated since, and I quote, multi-scale analysis, including fractal concepts, is needed to characterize phenomena that are smeared across a range of scales by the interaction of fast with slow processes. The interaction of fast with slow rates often plays out as the interaction of local with large-scale processes. That's David Schneider. We also need to remember the wider geographical and political worlds in which small-scale community studies are necessarily embedded. Although structural rigidity within various human bureaucracies may be preventing reorganization, change is essential if we are not going to face species extinction. It's that kind of structural rigidity in the academy that prevents emerging scholars from undertaking the interdisciplinary work they know is needed, and equally prevents academics from pursuing interdisciplinarity because institutions do not recognize or facilitate it, reward it, or get it funded often enough. And that has been my personal experience. Another is the apparent impossibility of getting the nations to agree to a fishing access strategy that produces equity for many rather than profit for the few. That's a problem of the rigidity that vested interests create, political, economic, national, and international. There's now a strong likelihood that the danger in which our global fish stocks find themselves is very much the result of this kind of institutional rigidity. For example, it's very unfortunate that many valuable data are not pulled and put to better use. More generally, I fear there is too little connection between various forms of knowledge and too little awareness of past work that's about mistakes made and lessons learned, and there's far too little international comparison and learning. It has to happen better and more often if we are to shift the direction of global and even national policies and management away from single-minded concentration on deep-sea fisheries and large corporate fleets. Vested interests remain considerable and powerful, and they can and do influence fisheries policy, often not for the good of the fish or the fishers. Thank you.
So if you have question for Rosemary, please post it on the chat or raise your hand. I think William had a question for Rosemary to start the Q&A. William?
Yes, thanks, Rosemary. That's a really inspiring talk and highlights a lot of the challenges that I also find in doing research, particularly trying to link global changes with finding local solutions that address that. I think maybe it's one question that I want to ask that relates to your final point on the challenges to do interdisciplinary research. And so I think given, I mean, you highlight the challenge, which I also agree, but a lot of our students and particularly the young scholars, they are at the IOF, they really aspire to do interdisciplinary research and address some of the challenge that you highlighted in your talk. So, I mean, you have so much experience in many of these interdisciplinary projects. So what would be the advice that you would give to them in having a start of engaging with these interdisciplinary lines of research and work?
Thank you. Look, one hopes it's getting better. The partnership grants program in the social science and humanities is encouraging, but it needs to be partnered with NSERC, and better still with the health people as well. And we did it in Course Under Stress. We actually had funding from both SHIRT and NSERC, and they never did it again. And it's very sad because we wanted to go on and look at, would you believe, climate change would have been very, very important, and the results from that would have been in. But it's still far too rigid. That institutional funding structure problem is still far too rigid. I rejoice in the Institute of Fisheries because you are rare, you are unusual, you are very special, you encourage interdisciplinarity, and you provide the support that is desperately needed. When your students graduate, don't forget them, because they're going out into a world where really there will not be very many people who have the kind of breadth of knowledge that they will have. And they're going to get pushed back into silos. And that has two effects in my experience with the students that I've worked with. They get very depressed, or they stubbornly keep going and have difficulty getting jobs and difficulty getting published, and very importantly, difficulty getting promoted, because what department is going to write their letter for promotion, for example? The institutional rigidity is dreadful, even in Canada. And I think the people who are party to and aware of and part of the Institute of Fisheries are really very, very fortunate. And your students are going to need all support you can give them.
Thank you, Rosemary.
Yeah, following up on William's question, I mean, he was focusing on students, but I want to focus on faculty, right? Because we have our perspectives, we have our disciplines and so on, and we are all trying to work together. So, and I remember one of the talks you gave a partnership project, the Ocean Canada. You actually gave us some advice on how you come into an interdisciplinary project, the kind of things, the kind of perspective, thinking you need to come to the table with in order for it to succeed. I wonder if you can tell not only our students, but all of us actually.
Let me tell you what I did when I started off here. That's what I know for sure. When I first started working with eco-research, way back at the time of the cod collapse, I knew I didn't know any fisheries science. So myself and two colleagues, both of them from sociology actually, and I trailed off to oceanography, and we went and talked to Dick Hedrick, who was the most approachable fisheries scientist available to us at the time. Dick being Dick said, well, you're going to have to take my course. And I said, can I audit it? And he said, yes, sure, you can. And I did. It was extraordinary. I understood after that one semester, I understood all kinds of things that I hadn't understood before. It was, for example, just a delight to be able to read the DFO graphs, because I didn't know anything like that before. And I could understand, first of all, what was important that they were doing, and secondly, what was missing that was so obvious. And we had students in that, we had a little bungalow in St. John's that had a basement in which we divided it up into little sections which had students, and we made a point of having a science student next to a social science student, next to a humanist, next to someone who was involved in health. Students are wonderful. You throw them together, they talk to one another, and they come away with some absolutely fundamentally wonderful stuff. It was they who told me that I was going to have to, for example, do two things. I was going to have to rent a house in the main fishing community that we were working in, and they would all go and populate it and take care of it, and they'd get to know the community. And that was biologists and even physicists and chemists. It was marvelous. The other thing that I would do, and the Fisheries Center, as I still think of you, the Institute of Fisheries could do this. Have a seminar that provides experts in a particular discipline talking about how their discipline contributes to fisheries understanding. So you're going to have a biologist, and you're going to have a humanist, and you're going to have a historian, you're going to have a sociologist, you're going to have anthropologists. There'll be all sorts of people, and their mandate for that one seminar is to give a brief overview of their subject in terms of the understanding that is necessary for the broader interdisciplinary base to understand their particular expertise. We did it, and it was absolutely marvelous. I learned so much from that. I can't think about it. I got on, I stopped being scared of scientists. I used to be terrified of scientists. I stopped being scared of scientists, and discovered that they were actually frequently charming human beings who would, if you didn't try and proselytize and teach them what to do, would ask them to teach you what they knew, could result in really, really helpful conversations. That's what makes people pull together. You know that, Rashid, from your teamwork. I know it from mine. You get people collaborating. It becomes then us instead of you. And that's where learning occurs. When I sat on the GLOBEC International Scientific Steering Committee, I actually did it again. There was a hugely important piece of research on krill in the Southern Ocean that was going on. I didn't even know what krill were, never mind how to spell them, never mind anything else about it. So I took this wonderful scientist aside and said, let's go and have dinner and you teach me, please. And she did, and it was marvelous. Your students, even when they have graduated, need to keep having a place where they can ask questions. It's much more important to ask a question than it is to proselytize. The learning comes from the questions, and the ability to learn and the confidence will come from the kind of support that places like the Institute of Fisheries can give them.
Thank you, Rosemary. We have a question from Mimi Lam. Mimi, if you can.
Yes, Mimi.
Hi, Rosemary. Thank you for a very interesting talk. Great to see you again. I just wanted to raise another scale complexity, and that is of values. It's something I've been working on, because values can range from the individual, the community, the societal level, even the global. And often policy interventions and governance is mismatched with what I think is often the salient scale of issue. And I think that's been demonstrated particularly through the COVID situation that we're all experiencing, but certainly also in fisheries, that when there's not and I don't think there has been an adequate recognition of the importance of scale of values or even values, but then that values are scaled, I think is something worth considering. Do you have any reflections on that?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Mimi. We could go on about the different kinds of scales forever. I talked about value, but I talked about it as motivation and goal. And these are semantic differences. You're absolutely right. The goals, one of the things we need to do, to thinking of Rashid and William, one of the things we're going to need to do is to be able to ask other people in other disciplines and people who are concerned about fisheries what their goal is and how that relates across scales, or at this scale or at that scale or the next. If we could get people thinking about different scales, if we can get them thinking about bottom up, if we get them, because values are all bottom up. That's individual values go all the way to the local, go all the way to the global. But the Prime Minister or the Glasgow Climate Change Summit, when it happens in November, are meetings of spokespeople who have their own values and who have been briefed on the values that are necessary. And the question I always have there is, does that reflect the local fishermen? Does that reflect the local wood stove operator? Does that respect what have you? You've got to get back down to the local level. And it's interesting that, it's people at the grassroots level know first when something's going wrong, because the tree at the bottom of the garden is going off. It's not growing the way it used to, or whatever. Those are things that actually tie into people's values because they love that. That's special to them. If you think values and motivations and link those two and make sure that they are not mismatched, because they so often are, that would help all of us.
And if I may, is that okay? Just to say that often it's a mismatch in the scale of the values as well, because it can be the individual versus society, right? As we see in fisheries and again with COVID, right? It's and how to reconcile that.
And there we get into the rights and responsibilities. I know it's very troubling, and I don't know how we are going to reteach society that of course we have rights, but all rights come trailing their own package of responsibilities, and the two need to be linked together, not kept apart. That's, I think, the major problem with the anti-vaxxers right now. Thanks.
Thank you. We have a question from one of our students, Zach, if you want to ask your question.
Thanks. Hi, Rosemary. I was just wondering, do you feel that the SES management model is a complete model, or do you think there's more to add, or that maybe it'd be too difficult to add more to it because it's just too many things to add?
Well, if you take a look at the right-hand side of figure 2, my own personal feeling is that that's something we grow towards, we aspire to, and I have no doubt that there are always more things that could be added. But I know that one of the things that's stopping fisheries managers and policymakers from breaking through into wider context is that if you give them too much, they just throw their hands up and despair. So I think it's hasten slowly and one step at a time, but not preaching, but instead encouraging what more could you do? That would be really useful. It's all I can really say.
No, that's okay. Yeah, thank you.
And I think we have a final question from Nigel. Nigel, do you want to ask your question, or you prefer that I read it? Okay, I will read it. There was a question for you, Rosemary. Nigel was saying, you mentioned social and ecological system, but said nothing about the spiritual dimension of fisheries. Can you tell us more about that?
I think motivations and goals, Nigel, are deeply tied in to spiritual dimensions, as was the reference I made to the Indigenous First Nations thinking on stewardship. Stewardship has a great deal to do with spiritual attitude. It's not left out, but it's a 40-minute talk. What do you do?
That's wonderful.
Yeah, I'm troubled by the association of spiritual with Indigenous. Indigenous people are much more articulate about their spiritual connection to the planet, but I would argue that the Indigenous connection to the planet, while older, deeper, more subtle and stronger, is no different from the connection of everybody to this beautiful place and the commitment of all the people I see in front of me to fisheries and the well-being of communities. And I think it needs to be an explicit part of our approach. Well, you know, I think that. You were on my committee.
Yes, thank you, Nigel.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to respond a little bit. So I am an Indigenous person, and I have to say that there is a huge spiritual aspect in stewardship by Indigenous peoples, and I don't want to discount that at all. I agree, Rosemary, with what you were saying, and just didn't want to brush over that because spirituality is a great aspect of Indigenous stewardship, especially when it comes to fisheries and our fishing communities like in BC.
Yes, thank you, Casey, and we all could learn from it.
And thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Rosemary.
My pleasure.